In the year 270 of the Common Era, the Roman Empire was in crisis. 4 emperors had died in 3 years. The Rhine frontier was under pressure from Germanic tribes. The treasury was depleted. The army was fractured. And in the Syrian desert, a queen looked at Rome's eastern provinces, Egypt, Syria, Arabia, and much of Anatolia, and made a decision that no ruler in the region had made in 300 years. She took them, not symbolically, not through marriage or inheritance or political maneuvering. She sent armies. Her generals crossed into Egypt and defeated the Roman prefect Tnagino Probus in battle. They marched up through the Levant. They pushed into Asia Minor as far as Ancyra, the city we now call Ankara. Within 2 years, Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, ruled territory containing more than 30 million people. She controlled the grain supply of Rome. She minted her own coins. She named herself Augusta and named her son Augustus, the specific titles that meant, "I am not a subordinate. I am the equal of Rome." You have almost certainly never heard her name. You were taught about Julius Caesar, about Augustus, about Marcus Aurelius, and Nero and Hadrian. You may have been taught about Cleopatra, though even there, the version you received was filtered through the men she was involved with, not the political genius she was. But Zenobia, the woman who effectively split the Roman Empire for 3 years, who built a multilingual, multi-faith imperial court in the desert, and who commanded military campaigns that Roman sources themselves describe as disciplined and formidable. Zenobia did not make the curriculum. That is not an accident. It is a choice, and this video is about that choice, who made it, when, and what it cost us. But before we get to the erasure, we need to understand the woman, because the erasure only makes sense if you first understand what was erased. So let's start with Palmyra. Picture a city in the Syrian desert, roughly halfway between the Mediterranean coast and the Euphrates River. It is the 1st century of the Common Era. The Silk Road does not run through Europe. It does not run through Rome directly. It runs through this city. Every caravan carrying silk, spices, incense, and dye from the east to the west passes through Palmyra, and the people of Palmyra tax it, store it, guard it, and profit from it enormously. The historian Fergus Miller, in his 1993 work on the Roman Near East, described Palmyra as one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the ancient world, a place where Aramaic, Greek, and Latin were spoken in the same marketplace, where Mesopotamian deities shared temple precincts with Greco-Roman gods, and where the merchant aristocracy had grown wealthy enough to fund public monuments that rivaled anything in Rome. This is the city Zenobia was born into, around the year 240 CE. The exact date of her birth is disputed. What is not disputed is her lineage. Ancient sources, including the Historia Augusta, a Latin collection of imperial biographies compiled in the late 3rd or early 4th century, record that Zenobia claimed descent from Cleopatra and from the Seleucid dynasty that had ruled Syria after Alexander the Great. Historians debate whether this lineage was literal or strategic. The answer, as the scholar Nathaniel Andrade argued in his 2013 study of Zenobia's self-presentation, is that the distinction may not have mattered to Zenobia. She was building an identity that connected her to every great ruling tradition in the Near East simultaneously. That is not the act of someone with limited political imagination. She married Odenathus, the lord of Palmyra, a man Rome had officially recognized as Corrector Totius Orientis, meaning corrector of all the East, sometime around 258 CE. Odenathus was himself extraordinary, a Palmyran nobleman who had stopped the Persian king Shapur I after Shapur's humiliation of the Roman Emperor Valerian, the only Roman emperor ever taken prisoner in battle. Odenathus pursued Shapur back to his own capital, twice. Rome was grateful. Rome gave him titles, and Zenobia, from the first years of her marriage, was not merely the wife of a powerful man. She hunted, she rode with the army. The Historia Augusta, and you should know, this is a source that is simultaneously invaluable and deeply unreliable, a problem we will return to, describes her marching on foot alongside her soldiers for miles at a time, wearing armor, refusing a carriage. This detail is mentioned in the Roman sources as a kind of marvel. A woman who could do that? It is worth pausing here to ask what the sources mean when they present this as unusual. They mean women did not do this, and Zenobia did it anyway, not as performance, as preparation. In 267 CE, Odenathus was assassinated. The circumstances remain murky, possibly a family dispute, possibly a Roman-sanctioned removal. He was dead. His heir, Vabalathus, was a child, and Zenobia, at approximately 27 years of age, became regent of Palmyra. Rome expected deference. Rome expected a widow to acknowledge the empire's authority, to wait, to ask permission. Zenobia did none of these things. Within 3 years, she had seized Egypt. This is where the story becomes extraordinary, and where the erasure becomes most visible. Because the conquest of Egypt was not a raid, it was not a border skirmish. Egypt was the wealthiest province in the Roman Empire. It produced approximately 1/3 of Rome's grain supply. Whoever held Egypt could, in practical terms, starve Rome. Zenobia sent her general Zabdas with an army of 70,000 soldiers, according to the 4th century historian Zosimus, who drew on earlier sources now lost. Zosimus, in his Historia Nova, records that Zabdas defeated the Roman prefect Tenagino Probus in a land battle, that Probus regrouped and attacked again from the sea, and that he was defeated a second time and killed. Egypt fell. Zenobia came to Alexandria herself. What she did in Alexandria is documented, not by hostile Roman sources, but by the city's own administrative records. She presented herself not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. She adopted Egyptian titles. She made political alliances with the Bishop of Alexandria, Paul of Samosata, whose theology Rome had recently condemned. The classicist Alaric Watson, in his 1999 biography of the Emperor Aurelian, notes that Zenobia's administration in Egypt was sophisticated enough to maintain the province's tax revenues and legal structures largely intact. She was not looting, she was governing. If you find yourself thinking, "Why didn't I know this?" that is the right question. Hold it. From Egypt, Zenobia moved north and west. Her armies took Syria, which was already under Palmyrene control. They moved into Arabia. They pushed into Anatolia, reaching as far as Ancyra in the northwest. At the peak of her empire, roughly in the years 271 to 272, Zenobia controlled the eastern Mediterranean coast, the entire Levant, Egypt, and significant portions of Asia Minor, by territory, by population, by economic output, by any serious measurement of power. She was governing a domain that matched or exceeded any contemporary empire outside of China. And she was doing it consciously. She was not simply expanding because expansion was available. She was building something specific. Her court at Palmyra had become, by the early 270s, a genuine intellectual and political center. The philosopher Cassius Longinus, one of the most significant Platonic thinkers of the ancient world, served as her personal advisor and court philosopher. Longinus had previously taught in Athens and Alexandria. He chose Palmyra. This is documented in the writings of the Neoplatonist Porphyry, who studied under Plotinus and who recorded Longinus's presence at Zenobia's court before 272 CE. Zenobia herself, according to the Historia Augusta, spoke Aramaic, Greek, Egyptian, and had learned Latin, though she reportedly refused to use it in official contexts, a choice that, in the 3rd century, carried a very specific political meaning. Latin was the administrative language of Roman power. Speaking your own language instead was a declaration. Yet she also appears to have been personally engaged in historical scholarship. The Historia Augusta claims she wrote a summary of Eastern history and was deeply familiar with Alexandrian learning. The historian Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, was dismissive of this claim. He found it implausible that a military ruler would also be a serious scholar. This tells you more about Gibbon than about Zenobia. The idea that commanding armies and reading philosophy are mutually exclusive activities says everything about the assumptions that shaped Western historiography for centuries, and nothing about the documented reality of Palmyra in the 3rd century. But something needs to be said here plainly, before we go further. There is a problem with the sources on Zenobia that is not a minor academic footnote. It is central to everything that follows. The principal Latin source for Zenobia's life and downfall is the Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies that modern scholars now largely agree was written not in the 3rd century, as it claims, but probably in the late 4th century, by a single unknown author pretending to be 6 different writers. It is, in the assessment of the historian Anthony Burley, one of the least reliable documents in all of ancient literature. It invents letters. It fabricates speeches. It includes obvious anachronisms. And yet, it is the most detailed surviving Latin account of Zenobia. This does not mean it is worthless. It means every specific detail it provides must be read against other evidence. And when you do that, when you put the Historia Augusta's account of Zenobia next to the Egyptian papyri that record administrative decisions from her rule, next to the coins she minted, next to the letters and documents from Palmyra's own inscriptions, what you find is that the broad outline of what she did is confirmed. She conquered these territories. She used these titles. She made these alliances. The Roman sources could not deny the facts. They could only reframe what the facts meant. So let's talk about the war with Aurelian, because this is where the reframing happens most visibly. By the end of 271 CE, Zenobia had officially broken with Rome. She stopped including the reigning emperor's name on her coins, a public declaration of independence that the Roman world understood completely. And she declared her son Vaballathus to be Augustus, placing him on equal footing with the Roman emperor. She declared herself Augusta. Rome could not ignore this. The Emperor Aurelian marched east in 272 CE. He was, by most accounts, one of the most capable military commanders Rome had produced in a generation. A man who had restored the western fragment of the empire before turning east. He was not underestimated. And what is striking, if you read the Roman sources carefully, is that Aurelian's campaign against Zenobia was genuinely difficult. His first major engagement with Palmyrene forces came at Imai, near Antioch. The battle is described in Zosimus's Historia Nova. Zenobia's cavalry, heavily armored cataphracts, among the most formidable heavy cavalry of the ancient world, initially routed Aurelian's horse. The tide only turned when the Roman cavalry feigned retreat, drawing the Palmyrene horsemen forward until their horses exhausted themselves under the weight of the armor, then wheeled and attacked. This is the specific tactical adaptation Aurelian made on the field. He did not defeat Zenobia's army head-on. He adapted. You do not need to adapt head-on when you are facing an inferior opponent. Aurelian adapted. The second major battle came at Emesa, modern Homs in Syria. Again, the Palmyrene cataphracts initially dominated. Again, Aurelian was pressed. The Roman forces ultimately prevailed, and Zenobia retreated to Palmyra itself. Aurelian besieged the city. Zenobia attempted to escape to Persia, seeking aid from the Sassanid king. She was captured on the banks of the Euphrates. What happened next is where the historical record fractures most dramatically, and where the erasure is most legible. The Historia Augusta gives two completely contradictory accounts of Zenobia's fate. In one version, she died at sea en route to Rome, either from illness or self-starvation. In another, and this is the version that subsequent Western history chose to prefer, she was brought to Rome displayed in Aurelian's triumph, wearing golden chains so heavy she required servants to help carry them, and then was given a villa in Tibur where she married a Roman senator, hosted intellectuals, and lived out her days as a respectable Roman matron, a barbarian queen, domesticated, a conqueror, converted into a housewife. The historian Richard Stoneman, in his 1992 study, Palmyra and its Empire, denotes that no contemporary source outside the Historia Augusta mentions this villa or this marriage. The coins from Palmyra stop. The administrative records from Egypt stop. The inscriptions referring to her titles stop. What we have after 272 CE is silence, and a Roman narrative designed to answer one specific question: what do you do with a woman who almost broke your empire? You make her comfortable. You marry her off. You make her respectable and harmless. You take the most dangerous woman in the ancient world and you write her into a garden party. This is not editorial oversight. This is not a passive consequence of time and loss. This is a deliberate narrative choice made by writers who understood that the story of Zenobia, a non-Roman queen who ruled Rome's Eastern Empire for 3 years, who commanded Roman-trained armies, who chose philosophers over generals as her closest advisors, who governed Egypt well enough that its taxpayers barely noticed the transition, was a story that Rome's self-image could not sustain. So they rewrote it. She was deluded. She was misled by the philosopher Longinus. She was brave, yes. The Historia Augusta is oddly generous about her physical courage, but brave in the way a wild animal is brave. She needed to be controlled, and Cassius Longinus, who had served her faithfully and refused to denounce her before Aurelian's court even when offered his life in exchange, was executed. The most significant Platonic philosopher of the 3rd century was put to death for his loyalty to a woman Rome had decided to write out of history. The scholar Sarah Savant, in her 2013 work on memory and erasure in late antique sources, has noted that Longinus's execution is almost never discussed in the same breath as his philosophy, as though the two lives, the philosopher and the martyr, belonged to different people. They did not. What strikes me about the Longinus detail is not the execution. Executions happen in war. What strikes me is the offer, life in exchange for condemnation of Zenobia, and the refusal. A man with everything to gain from betraying her and everything to lose from loyalty chose loyalty. That tells you something about what kind of queen she was. It tells you something about what Palmyra was, and it tells you something about why Rome needed to make sure neither of them appeared in your history textbook. So let's correct the record. The mechanism of erasure for Zenobia is not subtle. It operates at two levels. The first is the ancient level. The Roman authors of the 3rd and 4th centuries, writing in a tradition that had every incentive to make Roman victories seem inevitable and Rome's opponents seem flawed, constructed a Zenobia who was brave but misled, powerful but ultimately feminine in the Roman pejorative sense, meaning controlled by passions rather than reason, redeemable by domestication. This version entered the Latin historiographic canon. The second level is modern, and it is almost worse. In the 19th century, when European scholars were systematizing classical history, building the syllabi and curricula that would define what ancient history meant in Western education, they were working within a civilizational framework that centered Greece and Rome as the ancestors of European culture. The Near East, in this framework, was a background. Palmyra was a caravan city. Zenobia was an anomaly, a footnote, a curiosity. The historian Oded Irshai, writing about the modern reception of Palmyra in Western scholarship, noted in 2007 that the city was consistently framed as interesting primarily insofar as it intersected with Roman history, not as a civilization in its own right. The result is a woman who controlled a third of the Roman Empire for 3 years and does not appear in most Western history education at any level. That is not a small omission. That is a structural decision about whose power counts. Now, what survived? More than you would expect. Palmyra itself, the physical city, survived largely intact until 2015, when the Islamic State captured the site and destroyed many of its most significant monuments, including the Temple of Bel and the Arch of Triumph. The damage was documented in real time by archaeologists around the world, and it was catastrophic. But the surviving structures, colonnaded streets, the great funerary towers, the remains of the temple complex, had endured for 17 centuries after Zenobia's defeat. The UNESCO World Heritage designation before 2015 recognized Palmyra as one of the most significant archaeological sites in the world. The city she ruled and that Rome never truly replaced lasted. The Arabic literary tradition preserved Zenobia differently than Rome had. The Arab historian al-Tabari, writing in the 9th and 10th centuries, gives an account of Zenobia that includes her genealogy, her political legitimacy, and her military capability, without the Roman editorializing. In Arabic sources, she is Al-Zaba, the Queen of the Arabs, a ruler whose story entered the legendary tradition of the Near East, not as a cautionary tale, but as a record of power. This parallel tradition ran entirely outside the Western classical canon and was ignored by European scholars until relatively recently. The coins she minted survive. They are in collections in Berlin, London, Paris, and dozens of smaller museums. On one face, her portrait, with the Greek title Sebaste, Augusta. On the reverse, her son Vabalathus, with the Roman titles she had assigned him. These coins circulated across Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. They were how ordinary people in the 3rd century knew who was governing them. They are direct evidence, physical, touchable, undeniable, of a woman who declared herself the equal of Rome and backed that declaration with armies and grain and administrative apparatus. The coins did not lie. Rome did. Today, Zenobia has begun to re-enter the historical conversation, but almost entirely through specialized academic work that has not reached popular education. The literary scholar Patricia Salzman Mitchell published a study of Zenobia's literary reception in 2010 that traces the transformation of her image from Roman-era villain to 19th-century romantic heroine to contemporary icon. Each iteration, Salzman Mitchell argues, tells us more about the era receiving Zenobia than about Zenobia herself. The Victorian poets who wrote admiringly about her tended to frame her in terms of doomed nobility, brave but ultimately unsuited for politics. A century earlier, the English writer and historian William Ware had her speak in ways that confirmed European assumptions about Oriental excess and Eastern irrationality. The actual Zenobia, the one who governed Egypt efficiently, who built a multilingual intellectual court, who adapted military strategy to the realities of desert warfare, that Zenobia rarely appears. She appears in the Syrian cultural memory more clearly. Before the civil war that began in 2011, Zenobia was a presence in Syrian national identity, on currency, in public art, in school curricula. The historian Andrew Palmer, in work on Syrian historical consciousness, noted in 2001 that Zenobia served as a symbol of pre-Islamic Near Eastern civilization that could be claimed across religious lines by Christians, Muslims, and secular nationalists simultaneously. That is not a small cultural achievement for a woman who died roughly 1,700 years ago. What does Zenobia's story mean now? It means that the story of Rome, the story you were given as the origin of Western civilization, of law, of order, of culture, is a partial story. It is the story as told by the people who won. And the people who won had every reason to make their victory look inevitable. Their opponents looked diminished, and the alternatives look impossible. Zenobia was not impossible. She was real. She ruled 30 million people. She created an empire out of a trade city on a desert crossroads. She hired the best philosopher of her generation to help her govern. She conducted 2 successful military campaigns against professional Roman armies. She minted coins that said, in Greek and Latin, that she was the Augusta, the Empress, and she distributed those coins from Egypt to Anatolia, so that every merchant and soldier and tax collector in her domain would know who was in charge. And then she was defeated. And then Rome told the story. And the story Rome told is the one you found in your textbooks, if you found her there at all. I want to be precise about what I'm saying here. This is not a claim that Zenobia was a perfect ruler or that Palmyra was a utopia. The evidence suggests she could be ruthless. The execution of rival claimants, the management of conquered populations, the realities of ancient governance are not sanitized in serious scholarship. This is not a reversal of the hagiography, where the Roman villain becomes a modern saint. It's something more fundamental than that. It is a claim that the criteria by which we decide whose story is worth telling were not neutral. They were built by specific people in specific institutions with specific interests. And those criteria consistently placed Zenobia's story outside the frame, not because she was insignificant, but because her significance was inconvenient. An Eastern queen who matched Rome militarily and exceeded it administratively does not fit comfortably inside a civilizational narrative that places Rome at the center of human achievement. So, she was edited, domesticated, footnoted, occasionally romanticized, never taught. The question is not only who was Zenobia, the question is, what else is missing? If a woman who governed a third of the Roman Empire for 3 years did not make your education, what does that tell you about the architecture of what you were given? That is not a rhetorical question, it is a precise one. And answering it requires looking at each omission the way an archaeologist looks at a gap in the stratigraphy, not as absence, but as evidence. Palmyra was destroyed again in 2015. The Temple of Bel, which had stood for 2,000 years, was demolished. The iconic Tetrapolon was blown up. Khaled al-Assad, the chief archaeologist of Palmyra, who had spent 40 years excavating and preserving the site, refused to reveal where the most significant artifacts had been hidden and was executed. He was 83 years old. His name was al-Assad. He died for the same city Zenobia had died for, in a different century, for reasons that were different and the same. That city is still there partially. Our restoration efforts have been underway since 2017, though progress is slow and the political situation remains complicated. The colonnaded street still stands. Some of the funerary towers survived. The inscriptions in Aramaic and Greek that record the names of Palmyrene merchants and soldiers and officials, names that appear in no Western history book, are still legible on stone. Zenobia herself left no autobiography. She left no personal letters that survive. What she left was the record of what she did. The papyri from Egypt, the coins from Syria, the inscriptions from Palmyra, the battlefield accounts from Zosimus, and the grudging admissions of Roman writers who could not quite hide the fact that she had been genuinely formidable. The record is partial. All records are partial, but the record is there. History did not lose Zenobia. It chose not to carry her. If there is a name from this video you find yourself wanting to know more about, leave it in the comments, because the next video on this channel will be about another story that didn't make the curriculum, another figure who was real and consequential and edited out, and it may be the story you just mentioned.